The song stopped me before I could reach the office door. It was nearly 9 on a rainy Thursday night in Chicago, and the entire building had gone quiet except for the faint sound of a piano drifting from the break room. I had been ready to spend another lonely evening surrounded by spreadsheets, unpaid bills, and memories I never talked about. Then my secretary, Grace, began singing a song from the old radio station my mother used to love. When she reached the words, "Take me home with you," I froze. Not because the words sounded romantic, but because I suddenly understood that Grace wasn't singing about a house. She was singing about belonging somewhere again. Before we continue, if you believe kindness can heal old wounds, hope can appear in unexpected places, and everyone deserves forgiveness and a second chance, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs encouragement, leave a comment, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps stories like this reach people who may need a little hope tonight. My name is Nathan Brooks, and for most of my adult life, I had measured everything in deadlines. I managed a small architectural firm downtown, and my reputation was built on being dependable, organized, and nearly impossible to surprise. What nobody at work knew was that 3 years earlier, I had lost my wife, Hannah, after a long illness. Afterward, I stopped celebrating birthdays, avoided family gatherings, and turned my office into a place where emotions were considered distractions. My younger brother, Caleb, tried repeatedly to pull me back into normal life, but I always found another excuse. Work was easier than grief. Grace Mitchell had worked as my secretary for almost 2 years. She was quiet, observant, and remarkably patient. She never pushed me to talk about things I didn't want to discuss. Instead, she remembered the small things. She knew I preferred black coffee in the morning, knew which meetings exhausted me, and once left a handwritten note on my desk reminding me to eat lunch after noticing I had skipped it for 3 days. I thanked her, but I never asked how she was doing. That night, I would finally learn that I had been looking at her without really seeing her. When the song ended, I walked toward the break room and found Grace sitting beside the old piano we kept for company events. Her eyes were wet, and she quickly wiped them before noticing me. I expected embarrassment, but instead she smiled faintly and explained that the song reminded her of her father. He had passed away the previous winter, and the last year had been difficult. Her mother was struggling with loneliness. Her younger brother had moved to another state, and Grace had been quietly carrying responsibilities she rarely mentioned. Then she told me why she had chosen that song. Her father used to sing it whenever the family drove home after long days. To him, "Take me home" had never meant a building. It meant being with people who made you feel safe enough to stop pretending you were strong. Those words stayed with me. For years, I had convinced myself that strength meant carrying everything alone. That night, I realized loneliness could disguise itself as strength if you let it. Grace began packing her things, but outside the rain had become heavy. She checked her phone and discovered that her usual ride had canceled. She tried to call another service, but the weather had caused delays throughout the city. Without thinking too much about it, I offered to drive her home. She hesitated, then accepted after calling her mother to let her know she was on the way. The drive through Chicago was strangely quiet. Streetlights reflected across the wet roads, and the city looked softer than it usually did. Grace eventually told me about her father, a retired school custodian who had spent his life helping children who couldn't afford school supplies. She told me how he used to repair broken desks for free and how people still stopped her on the street to tell her stories about him. Then she asked about my family. For the first time in years, I spoke honestly. I told her about Hannah. I admitted that after losing her, I had become afraid of loving anyone or depending on anyone again. I had buried myself in work because work couldn't leave me. Grace listened without interrupting. When we reached her neighborhood, she didn't immediately get out of the car. Instead, she looked toward the apartment building and quietly said that sometimes grief makes people forget they still have somewhere to go. I didn't know how much I needed to hear that. The next morning, something changed. Not dramatically. There was no miracle, no sudden transformation. I simply called my brother Caleb and asked if he wanted to have breakfast that weekend. He went silent for several seconds. Then he said yes. That Saturday, I visited my brother's family for the first time in months. His wife, Rebecca, hugged me at the door, and their little daughter, Sophie, proudly showed me a drawing she had made at school. It wasn't a perfect day. I still missed Hannah. I still felt sadness. But for the first time, I understood that moving forward didn't mean leaving her behind. It meant carrying her memory while allowing life to continue. Weeks passed. Grace returned to her normal work, but our office changed in small ways. People started taking lunch breaks together. We began celebrating birthdays. Someone brought a secondhand guitar into the break room. Friday afternoons occasionally ended with music instead of emails. One evening, Grace played that same song again. This time, I didn't freeze. I smiled, because I finally understood the message hidden inside it. Home wasn't the apartment I lived in. It wasn't the office where I spent most of my days. Home was the people who reminded me that I didn't have to carry every burden alone. Grace had walked into my life as an employee, but that night she reminded me of something far more valuable. Compassion doesn't always arrive with grand gestures. Sometimes it arrives as a song, a cup of coffee, a ride through the rain, or someone willing to sit quietly while you tell the truth. If this story touched your heart, please support the video with a like, share it with someone who may be feeling alone, and subscribe so more stories of hope and kindness can find their way to people who need them. And before the story ends, I want to ask you something special. Leave a comment with one word that describes what home means to you. Maybe it's family. Maybe it's forgiveness. Maybe it's peace. Whatever that word is, someone reading your comment might need it today. As I drove home that evening, Chicago's lights stretched across the windshield like tiny stars. For the first time in years, I didn't rush to turn on the office lights or bury myself in work. I simply went home. And somewhere inside me, the silence finally felt less like loneliness and more like peace.